Once again, we welcome you back to Moving Forward with Young Voices. And we've had a little hiatus for the last couple of weeks, but we're very happy to welcome Alex Petropoulos back to the show. He's a Young Voices contributor. And Alex, anything you want to tell us about yourself, maybe a little bit about who you are and what you do?
Yeah, my name's Alex. I'm currently a writer and political commentator for Young Voices, and I'm also doing work on AI policy for a various number of places, helping to make sure that we make the AI safe.
Well, that's the big challenge today, isn't it? AI is definitely, it's something that is a part of society. I anticipate it's going to become more and more part of how we live our lives, much like the internet did. But as far as, how do we properly regulate it? That seems to be something a lot of countries are struggling with right now.
Yeah, and that's a really great analogy used of the internet. And I think that sets a very good lower bound of how transformative this technology could be. It's going to be as transformative as the internet, at least. It might be even more transformative. And that sort of uncertainty about, we know it's going to change a lot, but we don't know quite what will happen. We don't know which way things are going to go. That's the name of the game when it comes to the crisis that's grappling countries at the moment with how do they regulate it. There's so many questions that need to be answered, and the problem is that many countries are leaning to their traditional answer. They're leaning to traditional regulation, they're leaning to the natural built that they've always used in the past when a problem arises, which is good old-fashioned regulation. And there are some issues that raises along the line.
Well, let's start with regulation. What's the downside of traditional regulation when it comes to something like AI?
So probably the biggest downside I'd put forward as to traditional regulation is the fact that AI moves so quickly, the fact that there are paradigm shifts all the time. And the gravest risk is what I call like the illusion of safety, and the idea that you might think that you've prepared for the worst. You might think that you've passed laws, you've passed regulations, said, okay, we're safe. We've dealt with the whole AI issue. And then suddenly you have this massive leap in capability. And suddenly you have a massive shift in the paradigm of what AI even looks like. Because that's the thing. We don't know what GPT-5, GPT-6, GPT-7 will be capable of doing. We don't even know what GPT-5, 6, and 7 will look like. It might be a completely different paradigm of computation, a completely different way of thinking about AI. And so setting in stone, cut and dry rules of this is what AI is, this is how you regulate it now, when there's so many questions to be answered, I think is quite reckless.
Okay. I appreciate that explanation. Now, you actually offer a different alternative that maybe isn't the first thing that would occur to people, but traditionally this has worked pretty well throughout human history. How would cooperation and cooperative efforts be superior to just simple top-down regulation?
Yeah, so cooperation, coordination, collaboration, whatever word you want to use for it, that is what I see as the best way forward when it comes to solving these challenges and answering these unanswered questions. And what really makes this so feasible at the moment is the fact that if you look at who's at the frontier of AI development, you say, who is pushing out these top-tier frontier-level models, and you're looking at OpenAI, you're looking at Google DeepMind, and you're looking at Anthropic. Maybe you're doing generous, throw in Meta and Microsoft, but realistically it's 3 to 5 players. And that means that coordination between that small bunch is very easy. And you've got a group that knows the tech the best. You've got a group that is actually really invested in tackling these large societal issues their transformative technology might face. We saw there was a paper that came out 3 hours ago, actually. This is hot off the press. You're getting the real latest research here, which is coming from Google DeepMind, and they're sort of exploring different models for AI governance institutions and sort of saying, okay, if we wanted to cooperate on AI, how will we do this? And you look at the list of contributors to this paper, you've got people from universities all over the world. You've got people from Google DeepMind working on it. You've got people from OpenAI working on this research. So it's really already on the research end of things, a team effort. And so we've got to do the best we can to take that team effort out of academia and bring it into the political sphere as well.
Interesting. As you're describing this and how, collaboration and cooperation could work, it makes me think a little bit about how traffic works. As you're driving your car, you have thousands of people, say in a city, maybe millions of people traveling. All of them have different destinations, different needs, different goals as they're moving through traffic. But through cooperation, everybody seems, for the most part, to arrive at their destination safely. There are some basic rules that they have to follow, but for the most part, nobody has to tell you, now turn here, now slow down, no, do that, now do that. It's something they're able to suss out on their own. And I'm just wondering, is that kind of how you envision this type of collaborative effort between the different parties in terms of helping shape how AI goes from here?
I think probably a better analogy is we're all in this big city trying to get to our destination, but someone switched off all of our sat navs and our GPSs, and we don't know what direction we have to take. And so it really comes down to us having to plot a course together to try and navigate through this uncertain terrain, right? And, this paper I was referencing, one of the big questions they set out is we need to actually clarify and set down what are the benefits and what are the risks that we actually have to be considering in the first place. Because we haven't actually gone through the process of writing down a list and saying, these are the potential benefits, these are the potential risks. And then you have to look at, how can we make this cooperation happen? And what sort of institutional structures are we looking at? And, we could look at something like a public-private partnership that focuses on making sure that the benefits of AI are distributed democratically and throughout the world, so that it's not just the rich Western countries that benefit from AI. You want to set up some sort of international governance organization that has a private-public partnership that can spread those benefits around. On the other hand, you also need a governance institution that's really focused on sort of exploring and pushing the frontier of, what are these AI models capable of? What can they do? What are the risks we should be looking out for? And acting almost as like a library of knowledge for policymakers to come towards and say, we really want some help with writing our AI laws. We want to go to the AI governance, the Commission on AI, or whatever you want to call it, and say, please help us understand this problem better.
So, Alex, I'm going to ask you, we've got about 2 minutes or so left here, but what do you see as the most positive likelihood with AI? In other words, what are the things that you see that AI is bringing a real, quantifiable, positive aspect to, and what do you see as the potential greatest risk in the way that AI is currently developing?
I think the largest positive we could look at, and the largest untapped fruit, low-hanging fruit we have going for us, is all the possible advances on the medical side of things. There's so many gains to be drawn from the vast trove of data we have on healthcare. And you already see, DeepMind discovering ways to predict the way proteins will fold, discovering ways to detect cancers and kidney failures with AI models. So I think that it really could revolutionize healthcare, also things like education and whatnot. When it comes to risks, the risks are quite large. And, the amount of computation people have available to them is going to keep growing. And we could get to the point where everyone has the ability to create sort of a mini Ebola from home with their computer, just order the stuff at home and create it by themselves. And, I don't have to explain the sort of dangerous ramifications of distributing that sort of dangerous technology. And so it makes creating amazing, brilliant things way easier, but also makes creating quite destructive, dangerous things as easy. That's why we need this cooperation and these guiding principles to help us, like I said, navigate a path through this murky, murky swamp.
Okay, I love your explanation there, and you point out in your article there is a point where for some of the more potent AI models, regulation is going to be a part of. This is not a free for all. This isn't 100%. This isn't just anarchy, but very interesting. It's so strange to see the future developing all around us, and the sensation of change. It's pretty incremental and small, maybe hard to notice, but I get the sense that there's a massive shift taking place right now beneath our feet.
Blink and you miss it,
All right. We're talking with Alex Petropoulos. Alex, for people who would like to follow up on this subject, first of all, let's talk about where they can find you and where they can find your writing. And if there are any other resources you might want to point them toward, I would love to hear about those.
So you can follow me on Twitter, Alex T. Pet. And I'm talking about this stuff fairly often. As opposed to when it comes to resources, I'd read the DeepMind paper that just came out 3 hours ago. Go to deepmind.com and you'll find it straight up there. There are a lot of other organizations that are looking at this, Governance AI. In general, though, when it comes to it, there is a lot of work to be done. And so if you're interested in this, and if you spend, a week looking into this, you're already at the top 1% of people who know about this issue. And so if you really want to get involved, the bar is quite low for you to become an expert on this and really push forward the
Welcome back to Moving Forward with Young Voices. Hey, we're happy to welcome Tyler Curtis back to the show. Tyler, for those who are meeting you for the first time, take just a second to tell us a little bit about yourself.
Sure. Well, thanks for having me on, Brian. Yeah, well, I am a loan officer. I work at a community bank here in Missouri. But in my free time, I like to write articles about economics, politics, and sometimes religion.
And that's what we're going to be discussing today. And I actually, considering it was just a week ago we were celebrating Independence Day, I felt like your article that you wrote for realclearreligion.org was really timely. It's titled How Public Christianity Made Americans Free. And wow, Tyler, as I look around right now, any kind of public religious expression, at least of the traditional Judeo-Christian type, doesn't seem very welcome in the public square.
No, it's really not. And I think back to when Amy Coney Barrett was going through one of her confirmation hearings. I forget if that was the hearing for confirmation to the Supreme Court or for a federal judgeship. But Democratic senator has accused Barrett that she said the dogma lives loudly within you, despite the fact that Barrett was not talking about her religious belief in those hearings. Just the mere fact that she had strong religious beliefs was concerning for certain members of Congress. So, yeah, it's certainly the case that if you were to say, I'm motivated by my religious convictions to support a particular policy or law, that's going to make some people uncomfortable. But if we consider the way that the role that religion has played in the public square for most of American history, we can see that it has not really had that same conflict or same weariness that we see today.
Well, that's good news. I mean, you start your article with a quote from Christopher Hitchens, who man, he is not complimentary at all. In fact, he's pretty much is like, religion never did anything good for anybody. But let's look at the other side of that coin. Tell me about Mark David Hall and his book.
Yeah, so I wrote a review of Mark David Hall's most recent book, Proclaim Liberty Throughout All the Land. This is a short book, but very well researched, that talks about how Christians have influenced American culture and political life, especially leading up to the Civil War. And you're right, Christopher Hitchens, he's most famous as a journalist, but also as one of the so-called new atheists. And I use him at the beginning of my review of Hall's book as a foil. Because he wrote a book called God is Not Great, How Religion Poisons Everything. So he's working from this framework where religion is naturally suspect, and it never, to the extent that any human beings have done anything good throughout history, it's because of secular reason. And if they were religious, it was sort of accidental to their personalities. It didn't really motivate them to do anything good. And Hall takes not quite the opposite approach, because he takes a much more balanced approach and looks at the ways, specifically in America, that religious Christians have been motivated by their faith in Jesus Christ to create a much more fair, just, and equal society. And he notes that, yes, they didn't always live up to their own ideals, but it's the ideals themselves that impelled them to try to do better.
Boy, that's a good distinction, too. I mean, there are three accomplishments that you list in your article right off the top, or that Hall addresses, establishing a constitutional republic. I mean, considering how much some other nations changed their form of government, I mean, we've had something that's lasted a long time. Abolishing slavery, protecting civil rights. People forget that there was a religious dynamic behind each one of those accomplishments.
Oh yeah, absolutely. Well, and slavery is kind of the elephant in the room, and Christians really can't. We shouldn't shy away from the way that Christians have behaved in the past, especially in respect to slavery. There's really no getting around it. But what I think we need to point out at the beginning, and I'm sure that a lot of people have heard this argument before, but it bears repeating that slavery has been kind of a constant throughout human civilization, just as violence and all sorts of other types of evils have existed. But the institutionalized evil of slavery has always existed. So we need to ask the question, why doesn't, at least in the modern Western world, why doesn't slavery exist today, at least legal institutionalized slavery? And as Hall notes in his book, it seems to be because evangelical Christians in the United States, motivated by their belief in God and in the inherent dignity of all human beings, took it upon themselves to fight for the equality of and liberty of all people, regardless of their race or their particular circumstances. And they drew on the rich Christian tradition and Scripture. And I also it's important to look back and say that even though Christians participated in slavery, introduced slavery to the New World, there was always that inherent conflict between how people acted and the faith they professed. Going back even to the Middle Ages, Christians had realized that slavery was morally wrong. I think back to Pope Eugene IV in 1435, who issued a bull when the Portuguese were trying to colonize the Canary Islands, and they were trying to take slaves. And Pope Eugene IV had a bull called Sicut Dudum. And he said, if you guys enslave the inhabitants of these islands, you are automatically excommunicated. We do not condone slavery. And this is 60 years before Columbus even discovered the New World. And you fast forward to the founding of the United States. People that really cared about their faith understood, even if they didn't always do something about it, they understood that slavery was wrong. Very few people, if any, up until the 1820s, 1830s, really tried to argue that slavery was a positive good. Even people that owned slaves, they admitted that what they were doing was wrong, but they couldn't figure out a way to get rid of it. But they recognized it as a moral evil.
Well, and not to defend slavery, but I know that one of the concerns that some of the people who had slaves was to simply cut them loose would be essentially to sentence them to poverty and death because they weren't prepared, they weren't educated to take care of themselves. And that's not to say, therefore, slavery was a net good, but there was a reality of, just like you wouldn't turn a little child out on his or her own. The slaves were not prepared to go out there and make their own way in the world. So yeah, it was a problem that was much more nuanced and much more complex in many ways than simply, well, they just wanted to own other people. Talk to me about the effect on civic government or civil government as far as the respect for individual natural rights. How did Christianity influence, the way that government was established and the limits that were placed on it?
Yeah, that's one of the most interesting parts of the book, I think, that Hall goes into. I kind of wish he had gone more in depth because it really is such an interesting subject. Well, he begins the book by talking about the Puritans, who we look back on today as these, really oppressive theocrats. But In a lot of ways, we owe our civic rights and liberties to the ideas that were promulgated by the Puritans when they colonized certain parts of North America, when they set up their civil governments. They put limits on the arbitrary power of magistrates. They held regular elections. They held suffrage was, for example, much more widespread in Puritan New England than it was in pretty much anywhere else in the world. More men could vote. Of course, women couldn't vote at the time, but women couldn't vote in anywhere else. But the Puritans expanded suffrage more than any other place in the world and had checks and balances on their civic leaders.
All right. Unfortunately, we are up against the clock. We're talking with Tyler Curtis. Fascinating discussion. I appreciate you writing the article. Tell me where people can follow you on social media.
Sure. Well, you can follow me on Twitter at Tyler Curtis42. And if you're interested in reading my other work, if you go to youngvoices.com, type in my name, everything I publish is up there.
And we are back. This is Moving Forward with Young Voices. Happy to welcome Parker McCumber back to the show. Parker, for those who are meeting you for the first time, take a second here and tell us about who you are and what you do.
Well, thanks so much, Brian. I'm excited to be here. For those who don't know me yet, my name is Parker McCumber. I am a serial entrepreneur and a commissioned officer in the Utah National Guard. I'm a contributor for Young Voices, and I specialize in gun control and economic policy.
And I've got a great article here from you in front of me. This is in the Washington Examiner. 3D printed ghost guns make firearms bans dangerous. Now, I've been hearing a little bit about 3D gun printing. In fact, I'll have to admit, some of my favorite memes on Twitter are, people saying, the printer goes, to mock people who are calling for more gun control. But talk to me about what's happening in some of the states. I know there's been great concern about so-called ghost guns, say in California and Illinois and other states where there's pretty strict gun control. Is this spreading to other states that maybe have had more lax gun laws to this point?
So let me start with the kind of why. The reason I wrote this article in the first place was I saw the state of Connecticut had passed new firearms legislation that was raising minimum ages for firearms purchases. It was limiting the number of firearms that an individual could purchase and mandating increased training requirements. In addition to that, I saw states like Washington and Colorado that were introducing new legislation, and that legislation was passing, that was really cracking down on the ability to obtain AR and AK-styled rifles. Now, the problem with that is the 3D printer, the technology has outpaced the legislation, and I find that that's often the case. Legislation and bureaucracy are slow, and technology is innovative and wants to move quickly. Where that becomes a problem is that these bans ultimately have minimal effect, if any. We see it's actually kind of a eye-opening thought. If you were to just Google 3D printed firearm or 3D printed gun, there are literally tens of thousands of results that will come up, ranging from how to do it yourself in your garage, how to purchase a 3D printer on Amazon, and how you can crank this up. So ultimately, the issue is that it does nothing, these bans, this legislation does nothing in the way of achieving their desired result, and does everything to prevent law-abiding citizens from the best available means of self-defense.
So it creates criminals where there are no criminals. So let's say a law-abiding person said, well, I want to 3D print my own gun. Under these bans, they become a criminal simply by trying to do so. They haven't harmed anybody. They just, now they're violating a politician's words on paper.
Correct. And, despite these strict measures of gun control that some of these states are implementing, it's not reducing the prevalence or increase of these ghost guns or these 3D printed guns. And actually, we're seeing very rapid increases in their prevalence, particularly in their use for criminal activity. For example, in the article I cited, there was a report from the Buffalo, New York Police Department that in 2020, they confiscated 5 ghost guns. And in 2021, they confiscated 69 ghost guns, which is over 1,000% increase year over year. That was paired then with a New York Times article that was citing ATF data that specified in 2017, 1,600 ghost guns were used on crime scenes. And then in 2021, that number was over 20,000. So that's, again, over 1,000% increase in the prevalence of these firearms in a relatively short period of time. So ultimately, criminals still have the ability to very easily and affordably circumvent these bans and this legislation because the technology has just outpaced what anybody could reasonably keep up with. So I argue that the best way to enhance public safety is personal responsibility of your own safety, and to actually make it more easy and affordable for individuals to have the best means of self, home, family defense, and deregulating a lot of these more prevalent firearms.
I bet that doesn't go over very well with a lot of politicians, though. They seem very intent on, no, we have to control this. I don't know who you are, but I know I need to make it as hard as possible for you to own a firearm or the means of protecting yourself. And I agree with you, by the way, Parker. I think it's a very misguided attempt to try to control outcomes. But I think it was Lysander Spooner who said, when we approach laws that way, basically what we're saying is your freedom and my freedom now depends not on our own conduct, but on what criminals are doing as opposed to what we're doing.
I 100% agree with that. And it's very frustrating to me because I believe in championing personal responsibility and taking upon yourself the right for your own self-defense. I know there's been many instances where SCOTUS has ruled that law enforcement does not have a duty or an obligation to protect you. So I feel like a lot of this gun control push is based on this misguided principle that someone else will come and help you. Someone else will come and save you. Someone else will protect you from violence or harm. And that's simply not the case. Ultimately, at the end of the day, I want to advocate for individuals being ready, trained, trusted, and capable to provide their own self-defense and the defense of their loved ones.
Let's take a moment and talk a little bit about training, because people who have not had quality firearms training, they may tend to think, well, training, you just go out and you shoot, and you shoot the gun a lot. But the shooting is only part of the kind of quality training that a person should have, if they're going to use a firearm for personal defense. I mean, mindset and understanding what's going on around you and knowing when it's appropriate versus when it isn't. That's also a part of that training.
That's absolutely correct. And to be honest, I've been very blessed with my military experience and subsequently just the personal hobby and the desire to seek out that training. I definitely recommend that firearm owners seek that opportunity. And it can start with, like you said, just getting some time behind the firearm, learning how it operates, and becoming comfortable with its exercise and use. But additionally, there's a whole level of training where you need to become comfortable and proficient in its use while under stress and duress. And that training can then move to a subsequent level, because no matter what, if you were ever in a situation when you needed to use a firearm for self-defense, it is not going to be the same situation as you standing in an air-conditioned range, in your comfortable lane with your blinders up and a target on paper 5 meters away. So there's definitely some value that needs to be sought out in obtaining training. But I also don't think that, like the state of Colorado, Washington, and Connecticut are intending, that shouldn't be mandated by the federal government. And that also shouldn't be a deciding factor in who can and cannot then obtain a means for self-defense. So while I definitely encourage individuals to seek out that training and become proficient and comfortable with their firearms, I do not think it's the federal government's place to dictate what level of training is mandatory to purchase and own a firearm.
Hear, hear. No, you've said it. You've said it beautifully. Tell me about your take on 3D printing. Has the technology improved significantly? It seems like I've been hearing about it now for pretty much, I don't know, maybe the last 10 years that this has really kind of been on my radar screen, but I haven't followed it close enough. In other words, I don't have any 3D printed guns, but has the technology improved over that time?
Absolutely. And there was some kind of eye-opening research that I was doing while I was writing this paper to make sure that I was up to date on what I was talking about. It seems like 3D printing really kind of became prevalent in about 2013, and the technology was relatively low-key. It was a little bit more expensive. It wasn't as common. But I mean, at this point, now, almost, I guess, a full decade later, you can get on Amazon and buy a 3D printer that far surpasses the capability of just a decade ago for less than $100.
Wow.
And I mean, it's very readily available. And that's one of the factors that really circumvents these gun laws and legislation that they're trying to push. With today's technology, it's very easy to take a very affordable 3D printer and manufacture firearms literally anywhere. And one of the ATF-related articles that I had read actually said that they busted a 3D printing firearms manufacturer just in somebody's basement with about a dozen printers just creating firearms parts. Which, I mean, on that scale is a little bit scary to hear about, but also really highlights that there is a very low barrier to entry in these things. I mean, in the past, if you wanted to circumvent these laws, maybe you're going to a hardware store, you're learning to build these things yourself. Now it's as easy as downloading a file from the internet.
Again, we're talking with Parker McCumber, who is a contributor for Young Voices. Where can people follow you on social media, Parker?
They can find me on Twitter at Parker_McCumber. McCumber is spelled MCCUMBER.
Welcome back to Moving Forward with Young Voices. This is our fourth and final segment today. Happy to welcome Ethan Brown back to the show. Ethan, it's good to catch up with you once again.
Thanks for having me, Brian.
I know there are some folks hearing you for the first time. Let's take a moment here to make sure they know who you are and what you do. Tell us about yourself.
Yeah, I am a writer and commentator for Young Voices. I am also the founder and host of The Sweaty Penguin, which is a award-winning comedy climate program presented by PBS's National Climate Initiative, Peril and Promise. Our goal is to make climate change less overwhelming, less politicized, and more fun. And Friday will be our 200th episode, so do go check that out.
Congratulations. No, that's fantastic. So I'm looking at an article that you've written for The Hill, Why the EPA's New Carbon Emissions Rules Will Win in Court. And I'll admit, I don't have my finger on the pulse of this kind of stuff like you do, but tell me about these carbon emissions rules. What exactly is the EPA doing these days?
Sure. So under the Clean Air Act, the EPA is required to set standards on emissions for various air pollutants. And in 2007, there was a Supreme Court ruling, Massachusetts v. EPA, which basically said that carbon dioxide is included on that list. It is a greenhouse gas that drives climate change, and as such, it's important to our public health to regulate carbon dioxide emissions. That doesn't give the EPA full authority to do whatever they want, though, obviously. So they have to work within the confines of the Clean Air Act. They've made a few attempts at this. Under the Obama administration, they tried the Clean Power Plan, which essentially was requiring that coal and oil and gas plants actually transition they shut down and we switch over to clean energy. That was a bit of an overreach under the Clean Air Act, and the Supreme Court shot that down last summer. The Trump administration tried the Affordable clean energy rule, which was also shot down almost immediately for not going far enough under the Clean Air Act. But this latest attempt, I think, got it right. They basically are targeting power plants at the source. They're requiring that they take measures to implement things like carbon capture and storage, clean hydrogen, essentially regulating at the source, not requiring them to shut down, leaving that open as an option. But in this particular iteration, I think it was a lot more in line with what the courts and the law require them to do.
So I understand that West Virginia, though, is really not on board with this, and they're promising, hey, we'll see you in court. Why are they wanting to take the EPA to court?
It's really a suit if you do, suit if you don't situation. I think the argument against this sort of regulation, I mean, from a political perspective, there are obviously arguments against this sort of thing. When you're slapping on command and control regulations as opposed to leaving these things to markets and letting solar and wind do what they do best and be the cheapest, most effective energy source, including things like nuclear and all, like, that's a little more exciting than talking about slapping regulations on power plants. So I understand why there's a motivation to come at this sort of thing in the court. But the EPA's job is not to create policy. They don't have that directive or that power. The EPA is instructed to follow the rules of the Clean Air Act. And even regardless of whether we like the nuances of this regulation or not, I think that that's what they accomplished by creating this regulation. So
Congress are the ones who create the regulations in terms of the act, but the EPA is just kind of the executive agency carrying it out. Does that mean then that the courts are not going to find any reason to stand in their way or to tell them, okay, you have to stop?
Exactly. Congress makes the laws, the EPA and the executive branch enforce the laws, and the court decides if the laws break the rules of the Constitution and help interpret the laws. So I would be very surprised if the courts had any issue with what the EPA has done with this and with their tailpipe standards that followed a similar formula. Last summer, we saw West Virginia v. EPA, which was a very high-profile climate Supreme Court case, and that had to do with the Clean Power Plan. And the court adopted a pretty narrow ruling where they basically said that generation shifting, this was what the EPA termed the idea of shifting from coal and gas plants to solar and wind and other clean energy sources, that was not permitted under the Clean Air Act. The Clean Air Act is really about regulating emissions at a point source. So the Obama EPA tried to make the electric grid its point source in doing that, but the Supreme Court said, no, you can't do that. But not only can you still regulate carbon dioxide, but you are required to under Massachusetts v. EPA and under the Clean Air Act. So that's why I think this particular iteration that is specifically at the source, looking at carbon capture, looking at clean hydrogen, looking at that sort of thing, is very clearly based on what the Supreme Court asked them to do. If the Supreme Court shot that down, I think they'd be going back on their previous verdict.
Ethan, when it comes to doing this kind of carbon capture at the source, has the technology improved to where they're not being told, you will make water run uphill? Or basically, do they have the technology to do this, or are they being ordered to figure out a way to make it work somehow, and they've just got to suss it out from there?
The technology exists, and in fact, a lot of, I mentioned in the article, coal companies like PBD Energy, oil companies from Exxon to ConocoPhillips to all of them, they're all very enthusiastic about the idea of carbon capture and storage, and that's not surprising. If they can do it effectively, they can continue some of their operations in theory. So I think that the technology is there. The issue is it's not nearly as cost effective as using cleaner energy sources. And the way I see it as someone who works in climate, what excites me more is being able to use carbon capture and storage as an addition to things like clean energy to hopefully turn the world carbon negative someday and actually maybe get a little bit back to normal. So we can't do that if we're just using it to cancel out our carbon emissions from fossil fuel combustion. But certainly that doesn't mean it's not a viable technology. And again, this is what the EPA realized it had the power to regulate. So Congress can continue doing what it is to fuel a clean energy transition, but this is how the EPA can fulfill its obligations under the Clean Air Act.
So I have to ask, as a consumer, somebody who's enjoying air conditioning, for instance, right this minute, how does this affect the consumers? Does this, when the EPA carries out this policy and they're told, okay, we're going to do these carbon emissions rules, does it make it more expensive in order to meet those standards? And, ultimately that's going to be passed on to the consumer, right?
Possibly, but I wouldn't worry too much. First off, on the tailpipe standard, because that was another big one where the EPA basically said that car companies need to get the average emissions from their vehicles down to 82 grams per mile. For comparison, my Honda CR-V I drive would be around 275 grams per mile. That's not saying every car has to do that. That's saying the average across the company has to do that, I believe, by the early 2030s. Now, Ford and GM and all these companies have already set forth plans to transition very heavily toward electric vehicles. There are other laws in place that help create that transition. So I think that will ultimately lead people to save money. If we're making that transition, people end up with vehicles where they don't have to pay through the roof gas prices and have lower maintenance costs and everything. So that could end up saving people money. The power plant one, similarly, the EPA found economic benefit from the regulation as opposed to economic cost. How that gets passed on to consumers, I'm not exactly sure, but I do know the more clean energy on the grid, the cheaper stuff will be.
Okay, and this has nothing. This says nothing yet, even about including more wind turbines, more solar farms, that kind of thing. Maybe that's a topic for another time. I only ask because there's a massive wind farm that's being proposed near where I live, and it's interesting to see the reaction. Some people are like, "Yeah, I want clean energy, but not in my backyard. I don't want the means of getting it right here in my backyard." Got a little NIMBY going on there. Tell us where people can find your work, Ethan. Where can they find you on social media? Where can they follow your podcast?
Well, you can find me on Twitter, Instagram, TikTok at EthanBrown5151. You can find The Sweaty Penguin at thesweatypenguin.com, at PBS Peril and Promise, or anywhere you listen to podcasts. And if you want to support our show, you can check out our Patreon at patreon.com/thesweatypenguin. You get merch. We have daily bonus content over there now, so do go check that out.